Hey everybody, Bo Sanders here. I wanted to tell you about an interesting thing that happened this week. As you know, Billy Graham passed away, and I am not a neutral observer. I went to the Billy Graham School of Evangelism in the late 90s, and I actually went through the Arrow Leadership Program that was founded by his brother-in-law, Leighton Ford. So I am from that tribe, the Billy Graham evangelicals. That's my background. I was raised that way, I pastored that way, I was ordained into that kind of evangelicalism. And so it has been interesting for me to read both the celebration of his life and also some of the concerns about his ministry and the times in which we live. So it happened to coincide with last week. I got my credentials from my new denomination, United Methodist, and so I decided that post-construction and post-ordination transfer, it was time to move into my new office. Well, an interesting thing happened in that I have this filing cabinet and I don't have room for all of the files that I have been carrying and accumulating over the last 20 years. So I've been going through a bit of a purge. And so the unfortunate thing is that some of the artifacts of my previous life in ministry, I just don't have room to keep them around. It's something I'm not going to use going forward. So I had to get rid of my files on, say, the purpose-driven life with Rick Warren and other things like that. One of the files that went was my Wild at Heart file. That kind of masculinity, testosterone-fueled Christianity is not part of my current existence and ministry. So I didn't need that. It was a big file. I didn't need that anymore. And one of the things I found was actually a Promise Keepers magazine from 1997. And this is an interesting artifact. And I kept it because I had Billy Graham's face on it. And I thought, oh, he's pretty old. He might pass soon. And it turns out he did. And I was glad that I kept it because one of the things you have to be careful about when somebody passes, and the way we do retrospectives, is that they tend to get either made into heroes, hero worship, and celebrated, or they get villainized. And usually it's anachronistic. It's asking contemporary questions of a previous era when people weren't as woke as they are now and things like that. But what I would like to do is just say, I think Billy Graham is a fascinating case study. If you just look at his life, it shows us so many things that have changed about our culture and society, the church, and the way we do faith. So just think about these. In his early days, he was funded by a newspaper, a rich newspaper man. And so think about just the era of newspapers and even covering his crusades and how much press and buzz that gave him. Billy Graham is an early adopter of television. And think about how in the 50s and 60s, how television completely reoriented not just our media, but indeed our living rooms. The television, the introduction of the living room, changed it from a circle to a horseshoe. Everything was oriented towards the television. It changed our evenings, the way we spent time as a family, TV dinners, so many things. And he was an early adopter of television, his crusades being on televised. You get into 1952, and he made this amazingly progressive and justice-filled decision to integrate his crusades. He was an early adopter on that front. But by 1963, when Martin Luther King wrote his letter from Birmingham jail, it was exactly Billy Graham kind of ministers that were silent, hurtful, silent white allies for the civil rights movement. So that changed from 52 to 63. You keep going and you watch in the 70s and the 80s, and we get into the era of the TV evangelist with Swaggart and Baker and so many others that we could name. And by 1992, 97, in that era, Billy Graham had become really a proponent of this last generation thinking and his apocalyptic focus really signifies the evangelical shift that happened in that era that ultimately led to the Tim LaHaye and Jerry Jenkins Left Behind series that was very much created a fiction and a kind of a frantic notion about the whole thing. And then as Billy Graham aged, we got Franklin, who was politically showed his teeth. He was aggressive and even militant at points. And so you watch that kind of progression about what evangelicalism has become, even from Billy Graham's kind of ironic, generous posture, with its limitations or whatever. But then you watch it come through and become a more aggressive, agitated brand of Christianity. And now we're stuck with Franklin. So I just think Billy Graham is a great case study from the era of newspapers to television, civil rights, the Left Behind apocalyptic movement into aggressive political, the legacy of the evangelicals. I think he's an amazing case study for what has changed in one lifetime. And it's why I'm constantly trying to convince people that the future of the church is not to be found in the past. We really need to learn from this kind of study about how much and how quickly things both changed and are changing. And it's why I do public theology the way I do it, to update and innovate for today. And so finding this article on Billy Graham, and I can send you a link if I can find a live link about it. Otherwise, I might try and make it into a PDF or something. I don't want to violate any copyright rules, but I would love to hear your thoughts and reflections, your questions and concerns. This is a really interesting conversation about just how much has changed in just the last half of the 20th century and into the 21st. So let me know.